All right. Nope, that's not what I meant to do. There we go. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday, and for some of you, it's welcome to Thursday again. You're late.
I am?
Yep.
Well, you are always late.
I'm what?
You are always late.
I'm not always late. How dare you?
Huh?
I'm not always late. How dare you?
Well, like we got used to starting at 10 or 10, 10, and then you like surprised me and said, oh, it should be like 10:05.
I didn't surprise you. It's always been 10:05. It was 10:05 this week and last week and the week before that and the entire term before that.
Well, it's only one time.
It's only one time. Right. Right. Okay. Let's say hello to some people. So, Amanpreet is here. Good morning. Adil is here. Good morning. Blake is here. Good morning. Irene is here. Good morning to you. And Michelle's here. Good morning, Michelle. Okay. Let's go back to what we were talking about yesterday. We were talking about Mesopotamia. Why won't that switch? There we go. We're talking about Mesopotamia, and of course the first culture group to show up there, the Sumerians. And the Sumerians, we said, were kind of notable because they were one of the first people around that were creating these civilizations, the first civilizations on the entire planet, right? And so for thousands of years before this, everyone is hunting and gathering. Everyone is, living a very simple lifestyle. And then in some places of the world, people start to come together. They start to live in a single place. And they start to build and sort of create complex civilizations. And the Sumerians are among the first group to do this. And one of the other notable things they do is they create a written script, right? They figure out a way to encode their language in symbols so that they can write it down, right? And so we said we've got lots and lots of examples of Sumerian writing that we actually can read, right? So we've got all kinds of court documents and letters and contracts and accounting and stories and poems and all kinds of things from this period that we said, again, is very useful for historians and archaeologists because it, of course, lets you know what these people were thinking about, right? Which, of course, you can't tell otherwise, right? You can't tell what someone's thinking unless they tell you what they're thinking. And so here we can actually read what they were thinking and what they were doing. But also, it kind of gives us more perspective into their cultural world. And we were talking about this yesterday in terms of language itself and the idea that the language you speak or the language you are kind of thinking and operating in has at least something to do with the way that you perceive the world to operate, right? And we said every language kind of divides the world up a little bit differently. Every language structures itself so that communicating meaning properly, like in grammatically correct, communicating meaning has to be done in certain ways. And so that might influence a little bit about how you see the world. And so a very simple example I gave you is that for English speakers, we're very used to having a subject and a verb and an object in a sentence, right? So someone or something is always doing something, right? You can't have something happening without some sort of force behind it. And that might, people who might agree with this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis might say, well, that's a pretty strong connection between cause and effect, right? English grammar wants something to be doing something to something else. All sentences are kind of like that. And so that might play into a little bit of how English speakers think about cause and effect, right? Not in a direct way, but maybe in kind of a general sort of subconscious way. And so again, looking at a language like Sumerian or the Akkadian language that comes later might tell us a little bit about how these people kind of think about the world or think about the universe or think about the way of things, right? The way that they have encoded their world in symbols, right, might be important. a lot of what we have written down, of course, has to do with religion, and so we know something about the religious kind of life and values of the ancient Mesopotamians. There's quite a number of gods in the Mesopotamian Pantheon. A pantheon is kind of a family of gods, if you will. There's quite a few different gods. There's gods for war and rain and the desert and all kinds of different things. Because like we mentioned, Mesopotamians were polytheists, right? They worshipped more than one god. And these gods had control of kind of the natural environment, right? Different aspects of the natural environment. Of course, the relationship that the Mesopotamians had with their gods was one of kind of honor and respect, right? You sacrificed to the gods, you gave them the honor and respect that they deserved, and then hopefully they would, grant you a good harvest, and, all sorts of good things would come to you. But if you didn't, if you offended the gods, then the gods would punish you, right? And you might get sick, your farm might be destroyed by a flood, maybe your wife or your child would be killed, or if you don't honor the gods will punish you, right? So they have a very kind of transactional relationship with their gods, right? If you honor and pray to the gods will grant you good things. If you offend the gods or if you do not honor them, they will punish you, right? So there's probably about 12 or 13 kind of major gods in the Mesopotamian Pantheon. We won't go into all of them because it's confusing and bizarre. But there's actually lots of smaller gods as well. And so here you can see, a god for the river, a god for the trees, a god for making bread. I mean, every kind of aspect of existence is controlled by some sort of supernatural being. And also every city was protected by a god as well, right? So those ziggurats in the middle of the city, those were dedicated to a single god, and that was the god that was kind of the protector of the city, right? The owner of the city. And so every city-state had its own kind of god that looked after it. And the Greeks, other cities will do that too. The Greeks will do that kind of thing as well, but we'll get to them later. Right, so it was polytheistic. The gods were connected to usually natural phenomena. Oh yeah, and this is interesting too, and interesting to think about, is that the gods are, in some ways, the Mesopotamian gods are very human, right? So those of us who belong to a monotheistic religion like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, our God is kind of pictured in kind of a perfect way, right? Like God or Yahweh, or if you don't say his name, or Allah, or whoever your God you're talking about, they're kind of perfect in a way, right? They have no faults. They are the supreme creator of the universe and all things, right? But it's interesting to think about this in that the Mesopotamian gods were not that, right? They were very human in a way that they had a lot of human emotions, right? So sometimes the gods would fight with each other, right? Sometimes the gods would get jealous. Sometimes the gods would be angry and childish, and they would, punish someone maybe a little bit too much. Really, the Mesopotamian gods were very human, except in the way that they were kind of super powerful and immortal, but in some ways very human, in a way that, I think that maybe the monotheistic gods are not, right? We don't normally, at least in my experience with Catholicism, we don't usually think of God as childish or jealous or yeah, exactly. Greek gods are.
Maybe it has something to do with that there are multiple gods, so they're like helping out with each other's faults.
Could be, yeah. That's an interesting thought, is to think about the monotheistic gods as kind of these perfect beings, and then these polytheistic gods as being, pretty fallible, right? Having very human characters, and maybe it has to do with that, right? The fact that if you have a number of gods, they're going to come in conflict sometimes, right? They're going to interact with each other, and how are they going to interact, right?
But does not that show that they are not God? And God, because God like is almost powerful. And if somebody
Says you.
well, that's the definition of God, the one who will does everything.
That's your definition of God.
Okay, so what's the definition?
Well, that's what I'm actually. I have a little bit on religion with Egypt, but that's actually an excellent point, right? Is what is a god, kind of depends on what culture and society and religion you come from, right? And so your statement is like, oh, well, God is like this, and that's true. For many of us, our experience of God is that thing, but for these people, their experience of gods were a little bit different, and so. Again, in sort of culturally relativistic terms, everybody has different ideas of how the universe works, what supernatural powers are, and, how they imagine those supernatural powers to be embodied, if you will. And
Anything can be a god. I mean, if you worship a rock, that rock can be a god in your country.
well, yeah, and usually what it is, and we'll talk about this maybe next week in a little more detail, but yeah, the idea here is that, again, every society has some sort of idea of a supernatural power, and they describe it in a particular way, right? And so the Catholics describe this supernatural power as God, right? The Father of Jesus, and the creator of the universe, that is God, right? These Mesopotamians here, they say, yes, there's supernatural power, but it's kind of divided up between all these different characters who use their power, to control the earth, to benefit humans or to punish them, sometimes, in conflict with other gods. But it's just like language, right? They've divided up that power in different ways. If you think about Star Wars, for instance, even though it's a fictional universe, Star Wars has the Force, right? There's no God. There's just this supernatural energy force that seems to, bind the universe together and seems to have a will, right? The will of the Force, right? And so, again, that's a different kind of supernatural power that's not focused in one place, right? So monotheistic religions focus their supernatural power in one being. Polytheistic religions separate that supernatural force out into a bunch of different beings. And then there's ideas like the Force or the Tao, right, where it's everywhere, right? It's not focused in any particular spot. It's just all around us, right? So again, it's how you think about supernatural power and how you kind of explain things that humans cannot really explain, right? So that's kind of what's going on. So, and yeah, we all have different definitions of what that is, right? What that spiritual or supernatural power might be.
How did they know that this thing is a god for this like that? The scholars now they are studying the Sumerians and others. How did they know like this god is for this thing?
Oh, well, basically because of their writing. And so we'll talk about that very shortly. In the epic, we'll get a little summary of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so this is, as I mentioned, kind of this epic story. It's a hero story. It's the first story that we have evidence of, the first story that's ever written down. And we know some of these things because some of the gods are characters in the story. And so Gilgamesh, who is a demigod, so he has his father is a god and his mother is a regular human. So he's a demigod, and he interacts with the gods throughout this story, and you'll see it very shortly. So yeah, that's one of the ways we know. We read their writing and we hear what they say, and they'll say, oh, Marduk, the god of war, did this. And it's like, oh, okay, they have this god and he's the god of war, right? So you kind of piece it together by things that they write down, religious hymns, religious prayers, and stories that reference the gods, which Gilgamesh does. But we'll see that very shortly.
Who taught them this language? Since like it's been way like for a long time. You know, like for recent languages, for English, we study it from a teacher who has been studying it from an old teacher, from teachers, from elders, and like so on. How do they learn this language?
Like where does language come from?
No, like how they learn the Sumerian language.
The scholars, how do they learn it?
Yeah.
Usually what you need is you need things that are written in, you need something that's written in multiple languages, and you need a language that you still understand. And I don't remember the exact story. I know the process of kind of decoding this language took a long time. I know the story of decoding Egyptian hieroglyphics a little bit better. And the way they figured those out was a stone tablet they found in a place called Rosetta. If you've ever heard of Rosetta Stone, that's what it is. And the stone has 3 sections of writing on it. And it's kind of like, I think it's a tax document or something. But it's got 3 sections of writing. And so one is in hieroglyphic, the sort of ancient Egyptian script. Then there's one in hieratic, which is a shorthand version of Egyptian. Neither of those we knew how to read. And then the last part was the same thing written in Greek. And so because scholars knew how to read ancient Greek already, then they went about working backwards, trying to figure out what meant what, right? And so again, I think it took something like 20 or 25 years to figure it out, but eventually they were able to work back, and now we can read ancient Egyptian in all 3 of the forms of their writing. But you usually need something that you already know so that you can kind of compare it back and forth and try to piece it together. But it's not an easy process, and it takes a lot of work.
So if it's based on personal work and they figured out themselves and it's not been taught to them, can it be like they made a mistake with interpretation?
Sure.
Like gods, they referred as gods. Why didn't they like? How about if the Sumerian meant by gods what they calling it as heroes, not actual gods, or a powerful man, a man or a thing or a person with so professional at something, they call it a name that they interpret it into God.
Well, that's something that that sort of linguists and classicists and philologists, if you will, that's kind of what they do in their academics, right? Is they translate things and then they kind of argue about each other's translations and interpretations. And so, there's lots of kind of debate and discussions, and, over time, we get better and better at decoding this stuff. And so, the first time through, it may not be a perfect translation, but as other researchers and academics look at work and review it and critique it, we get closer and closer to the true meaning of things. But it's a long process, and it's not easy, right? Nobody really speaks Sumerian anymore, so
Yeah.
it's
Also the same thing in Arabic. When we say Allah Akbar, so they think, oh, we're saying something now. It's become a stereotype, like for terrorism.
yeah.
And also they say like when we say Allah, Allah means God, literally means God. But everybody like now is saying Allah means like something different we are worshiping, but it literally means God.
Yeah.
They are making something. They're thinking. They're convincing themselves that we are worshiping something strange or something. God, literally God.
Exactly. But that's an important point too, because we should, this is something we talked about in social justice that we haven't talked about here, the difference between informed knowledge and opinion, right? And so this is just people's, they hear it in a movie. They hear someone say Allah Akbar in a movie, and they're like, oh, that's something that terrorists say, and then they sort of give it their own meaning, right? They think they know what it means, but of course, people who speak Arabic say no. It literally means God is great.
Yeah,
That's all it means, right? Yeah, and so, and so here, like when we're talking about Mesopotamia, yeah, like this isn't just random people. This is people who have dedicated their lives to reading and interpreting cuneiform. So they're really working hard on it. Like they've devoted their entire life to reading this stuff. And so yeah, they're pretty careful about their interpretations and their translations. And it's not, like I think we could probably very intuitively, look at something like this, even if we don't know much, we can look at something like this and say, yeah, that's probably not easy to read, right? It takes a lot of training and study to be able to read these things and decode them and understand what they mean. But it can be done, right? People have been reading cuneiform for probably about 100 years, and so it can be done, but it's not simple. And yeah, sometimes mistakes get made, and then
ruin a culture.
well, you're not going to ruin it.
It does not ruin it. It does not inform it correctly.
It's true. It's true. The other thing that might be important to remember too here is intent, right? So, the person who, hears someone speaking Arabic in a movie or something and makes an assumption about what's being said, that's kind of different from people who, again, have like dedicated their lives to this, right? Like they're so interested in ancient Mesopotamia and Sumerian and cuneiform writings and language that, yeah, they've spent their whole lives studying this. And so they're not going to be, do you think they respect the culture? Yeah, they love the culture, right? They're trying to sort of unearth it and bring something back that, has almost been lost, right? So for them, it's a real labor of love to bring it back and to get it right and present it and say, look, this is what these people were doing. This is what they thought. This is what they believed. It's not, it's possible they may misrepresent something, but if they do, it's certainly not, it's not on purpose, and it's not out of ignorance, right? They very much want to understand what was going on and what these people were doing. And yeah, so, are there errors? Yeah, right? This is not an easy thing to do, but they will persist anyway because of their interest and their kind of love for the culture. And you have to love this stuff to spend all of your days with a magnifying glass staring at these little rocks trying to figure out what they tell you. It's not easy. It's not easy. Right. Okay, so it was polytheistic. The gods were a little bit different. Right. Sorry, I've got a little bit of duplicate information here. I think I need to edit my slides. But again, sacrifices were given to the gods in order to honor them and to please them. And if you didn't please them, you were going to get punished in one way or another. Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. And interestingly, the Mesopotamians didn't seem to have a very clear idea of what happened after death, or at least not a very rosy picture. And so I think maybe some of us have an idea or a belief of what happens when you die. Is there a life after that, and where is it, and how do you get there, and who's in charge? Some of us have ideas about that. For the Mesopotamians, they didn't really seem to have a clear idea of this. And so there's stories and kind of references to people just kind of entering an underworld and just sort of sitting in the darkness and eating ash or something. Like, it's a really depressing, awful place. And it doesn't seem to matter if you were a good person or a bad person. It seemed like everyone just went there, which is kind of, again, a little bit depressing and strange, but that seemed to be what they were thinking. Okay, here's an interesting thing. Two of the ideas in this course that are woven in here is that, one, understanding diversity and complexity in cultural expressions like art or literature in one culture enhances our understanding of other cultures, right? So once we learn to kind of decode meaning and significance from certain cultures, we can kind of use those to sort of understand our own and to understand others. And the second one here is that interactions between people's belief systems, their social organization, and their language influence those expressions, that art or literature or whatever it is. So to that end, I want to kind of ask ourselves this question. What can we learn about Sumerian culture by looking at the story of Gilgamesh? Because it seems that the Gilgamesh story was quite popular. It was probably told in this area of the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years until it was finally written down. And again, it's our first evidence of a story, first evidence of story in human history. There were certainly stories before, but again, if nobody writes them down, we don't know what they are. So this is the first one. So what can we learn about humans and about Mesopotamians by looking at the Gilgamesh story? And is story really that big a deal? What do you think? Are stories a big deal?
Yeah, it tells so many things about one's culture or behaviors.
Good, yeah.
Expectations.
I want to add a little bit to this idea of the importance of story by listening to a guy named Jonathan Gottschall. And so Jonathan wrote a book here called The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human. Okay? And so Jonathan has, his book is kind of based, as you can see, on neuroscience and psychology and biology. And he's trying to kind of make a case that telling stories is a very kind of fundamental part of what it is to be a human. At the beginning of this class, we said, what are humans like, right? What does it mean to be a human? And we talked about cooperation and intelligence and language and walking on 2 feet. We talked about all those things. But Jonathan here is saying, yeah, but we should include storytelling in that as well. Because Jonathan thinks that telling stories and stories themselves are a critical part of what it means to be a human being. Okay? So I'm going to show you a little talk that Jonathan Gottschall gave, and then I'll ask you 3 questions based on what he said. So what kind of stories do we tell ourselves today? I'll ask you that. What happens to people's brains as they engage with story? It's really interesting. And 3, why do people tell themselves, why do humans tell themselves stories? Okay, it's just 3 questions. The video here, oops, where is the video? Oh man, hang on. Hang on. There was supposed to be a slide with a video there. What's going on? Technical difficulty. That's that one. Oh shoot. Okay, just 1 second here, 1 second. I just got to find something. Thought I did that, but I must have deleted it. Always check your slides, people. That's the lesson here. Here he is.
Friday's not bad.
Okay. So for those of you who are online, I'm going to put, unless Microsoft Teams crashes on me, which it just did, I'm going to put the link for the video in Microsoft Teams in the sort of main chat. And so you'll be able to watch it kind of on your own, of course, and I'll show the video here in class, and then once the video is done, we'll come back and talk about what we've seen. Okay. All right. So the link is in Microsoft Teams, and as I mentioned, I will ask you these 3 questions. What kind of stories do we tell ourselves? What happens to people's brains? And why do people tell themselves stories, okay? So online people, will see you in just a few minutes after the video, and we'll talk about these questions. Yeah, see you in just a few minutes. Okay, and we are back. So on a scale, I'm almost frightened to ask this, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how interesting was that TED Talk? 1 being, oh God, totally boring, and 10 being, wow, that was super interesting.
6.8.
6.8. I'll take that. Nicholas is kind of looking at me like -2. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating what Jonathan says. Ooh, we got an 8.5. All right. 6.8, 8.5. I'm very interested in how precise you are. You know, like a simple 7 or whatever would have done, but you're right down to the decimal point. I find that very interesting. So Jonathan starts out with a bit of a dirty joke, which was kind of off color, but I apologize for that. But then he talks to us about the fact that his main argument, right, in that, you know, in trying to discover what a human is and what we're like, one of the things that we've been forgetting about is that, yes, we have a big brain and we build all sorts of tools and sophisticated cultures and we walk on 2 feet and all this kind of stuff. But he's saying that we also are storytelling animals, right? That's an important part of what we are, is telling of stories and consuming of stories, right? And so what kind of stories do we tell ourselves today? What kind of things does he mention? Holy stories, yes. So religions are, you know, and again, we'll look at this from an anthropological perspective, but yeah, religions are collections of stories, right? The Bible, either the Old Testament or the New Testament, is all story, right? This person went to this place, and then this happened, and then they talked to this person, and then God did this, and then it's all one big story, right? The New Testament is 4 different versions of the same story, basically, right? The life of Jesus told 4 different ways. What else? So we've got holy stories, we've got religious stories. What other stories? War stories, yeah. Kind of other love stories. How do we consume these stories? Films, yeah. Films are stories, right? What else?
He said, like, why do we like stories more than others?
Why do we like some stories more than others? Yeah.
No, not some stories more than others. Like, why do we prefer stories? Like, for myself, I prefer stories more than reading a book about the same story.
Oh, that's a question you have?
No,
Or-
I think that's
I don't know that he specifically asked that, but it's a good question about, you know, why some stories we like more, or why we like stories in certain media or certain formats. That's an interesting question. Let's come back to that one. But let me hear, what other kind of stories or how else do we access story?
we make them in our minds.
We invent them. We invent them in our minds. Little kids are very good at that, right? They'll come up with the craziest stuff you've ever heard, right? We dream, yeah. Jonathan says that our brains stay up all night telling themselves stories. Isn't that a weird way to think about dreaming? You go to sleep and your brain stays awake and tells itself stories all night. Sometimes you remember those stories and sometimes you don't, but that's weird. How else? We have movies, we have television shows, right? Movie theaters. Does anyone binge shows on Netflix? Of course, right? Very common. Books, music, right? Most songs with lyrics are frequently stories, right? They're short little stories. Jokes are little stories, right? He points out at the beginning that if you go to see a comedian, they're kind of telling stories, right? Funny stories. So there's all, and when we get together with our friends, what do? Stories. Dude, you will never guess what happened to me yesterday. Blah, 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 right? It's a story. And so we're constantly creating stories, listening to stories, reading stories, watching stories, telling ourselves stories about what happened in our day, right? Jonathan Gottschall says, without story, that our lives would be a chaotic mess, right? He says they'd be all sound and fury and signifying nothing. How would you make sense of your life? How would you make sense of who you are without story, right? When we think about, if I ask you the question, who are you? Like, who are you as a person? Part of that has to do with your story, right? Where you come from, what your parents were like, what your childhood was like, what's happened to you in school and in life. What kind of things did you see and hear and experience that, opened your eyes to something or got you interested in something that you're currently interested in? All of those are parts of a story, and that's kind of how we understand who we are. We understand who we are based on the story behind us, right? What's happened to us. And do you ever do that? Do you ever kind of like think back over the events of your life and try to make sense of it all? Yeah, of course you do, right? And that's what you're doing, right? You're reviewing the story and you're like, okay, what does this all add up to? What does this mean, right? Who am I as a result of all of these people and events and situations, right? And so, yeah, story is an incredibly important part of our lives, and we're constantly doing that, right? And so he rather cleverly shows that trailer from Paranormal Activity 3. Has anyone seen that movie? Paranormal Activity. Does anyone like horror movies here? Do you? They're way too scary for me. Especially ghost stories. Those ones freak me out. Like, ugh. Maybe for you.
I might like watch them in the day, but never at night.
Never at night. No. That's
It's like around 12, 10 at night.
that's the worst. Ugh.
And when lights are off, there's no one.
Oh my God. That would.
What other than
I'll never sleep again. I'd never sleep again. That's kind of. That's wild. But it's interesting, right? Because what does he say happens? Like if you take an MRI brain scan of someone who is reading a story or watching a movie, like a scary movie, in the house alone at midnight with the lights out. Are you crazy? Anyway, what's happening to our brains? What is he say?
engaging with the story?
It's definitely engaging with it, but in what way?
We're immersed in it. Like, it's almost like we participate.
Yeah, it's almost, the parts of your brain that are kind of activating and lighting up, those are the parts of the brain that are associated with what's happening on the screen, right? So he says when the character on the screen is sad, if you're into the movie and if you're into it, the part of your brain that's lighting up is not the part where, oh, I'm watching someone who's sad. Look, there's a sad person there. It's, I am sad, right? Your brain is sad because it's watching someone who is also sad, right? Or your brain is excited because the person on the screen is excited, or the person on the screen is terrified. Or maybe more interestingly, even though something terrifying is happening in the film, the person on the screen is not terrified, which is actually even more interesting. Although sometimes in horror movies they often are, right? But in other kinds of movies, they're not. I'm thinking of like maybe a movie like Hellboy or Van Helsing or something like that, where there's all these scary things and like the hero is like, he's killing them all and he's not scared at all, right? That might be interesting too, because, in theory, you should be scared of all of these creatures or zombies or whatever it is, but the hero, the guy on screen, or girl, appears not to be frightened. That's interesting. But yeah, Jonathan says that our brains are lighting up. We're experiencing the same emotions as the person on the screen. We're not watching someone have those emotions, which is incredibly interesting, right? Okay, so we talked about that. What else did he talk about that was interesting? The other thing I was thinking about with that emotion thing is the thing that came to mind, and I don't know why this scene came to mind particularly, but has anyone seen this kind of obscure film called Avengers Endgame? Has anyone seen that one? You may not have seen it. It's not very popular. Yeah, only the entire planet has seen it, right? You know when Thor and Rocket go back to Asgard, they've got those little space-time GPSs and they go back to Asgard, and they're trying to get what stone are they trying to get? They're trying to extract it from. They do that after, or do they do that before? No, that's after the axe. But they go back to get one of the stones, the reality stone or the mind stone or something, and then Thor kind of reunites with his mother, and they have a little mother-son moment, which is very touching. And then they're just about to leave, and he holds out his hand, and then his hammer returns, and that that scene kind of popped into my head as like this super exciting, triumphant thing, right? And of course, Chris Hemsworth acts he acts it very well. But, I'm sure the audience felt that like, oh, it's back, So, but again, and that's the thing, right? Is that movies, that's one of the reasons why movies and television are so engaging, because we're not just watching it happen, we're feeling the same thing as the characters feel, right? Especially if we're invested in the story, right? Especially if we're into it, right? So why then do people tell themselves stories, would you say?
Satisfy themselves of something that happened and they were not satisfied with.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, let's say that happens to me a lot when I'm in an argument with somebody. And let's say I lose the argument. I'll go back. What did I tell him or told her like this? If I told her this, then she would not know how to reply to me, or I would reply another way, and I could have won the argument.
Yeah, you kind of revise history, right? You have an argument with someone, and then there's something you should have said, but you didn't say it, and then you retell yourself the story again, right? To understand how it went, to understand what went wrong, to maybe soothe your ego a little bit. It's like, oh man, if I would have said that, she would have just been so, you kind of reclaim a little bit of your maybe not dignity, but pride or something, right? You're like, oh yeah, I could have said that, and that would have ended that, right? You can revise history a little bit. Why else do we tell ourselves stories? Sure, trying to give meaning to our reality, or trying to maybe understand our reality by looking at a fictional one, right? And sort of creating some sort of comparison between the two. Why else? Entertainment, yeah, stories are fun, right? Apparently, watching scary movies in the dark alone is fun, although not for me, but for you it is, right? So, yeah, that stories are fun, right? We like to, particularly stories that are scary or are adventurous or are funny. Yeah, those are great fun, right? Why else?
To learn our cultural value and beliefs. Like a lot of myths and legends have moral behind them. So,
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a second. But yeah, stories, particularly mythological stories, are excellent embodiments of cultural beliefs and values, and they help transmit those beliefs and values to the culture and to the younger generation, right? I would argue that that series of Marvel movies, those whole Marvel Universe movies, they're kind of like a new mythology, right? I know those characters existed in comic books, of course, but they've almost created this new kind of mythical world with all of these mythical characters. And those movies are very heavily influenced by cultural values. And sometimes the sort of conflict between cultural values, and we don't have time to get into it, but that's, I think, the whole story of like Tony Stark and and Captain America, is that those two characters have very different values, and they bump into each other a little bit because they don't agree on how things should be, and then they kind of evolve, and it's a whole thing. Anyway, yeah, stories are excellent transmitters of cultural meaning. What else?
For future events.
For future events? What do you mean?
Like to prepare themselves for something happen in the future. Let's say for your future career, if you did not work, what will I do? What will happen? How I will make myself pass through a hard time.
Yeah, movies can be inspiring, right? In ways, in sort of personal ways or in professional ways when you're looking at careers. Yeah, you see how someone a hero that you kind of look up to, how they handle a situation, and then maybe you try to do the same thing, right? Maybe you're inspired to kind of, get through things the same way as one of your movie characters or book characters has, right? Hadila said, yeah, to share or to learn others' experience, right? So, yeah, I don't know what it was like to, live as a slave in the southern United States a couple hundred years ago, right? But maybe I could watch the film 12 Years a Slave, and maybe I could see a little bit of that experience, right? Maybe I could gain a little piece of what that might have been like, right? So we can stand in the shoes of other people for a short period of time and just see what it's like, right? See what it would have liked to have been a slave in southern United States 150 years ago, or see what it might be like to be a brave explorer sailing the sea, or what would it be like to be, an Asgardian god. I don't know, but there's all these different experiences that we can have by kind of putting ourselves into the world of these other people, whether it's a real world or whether it's a fictional world. Anything else?
Treat yourself.
Sure. You can treat yourself. True.
Be your own hero.
Yeah, you can be it. What do you mean by be your own hero?
Make a fictional story in your head and be the one who saves others.
Sure. You could make a fictional story and you could be the one who saves others. I think that's what Donald Trump did. I think he made a fictional story of who he was in his head, and then he kind of asked everyone else to believe it, and then some people actually did. But he's another story. What about experiencing emotions, right? Like if you're experiencing the emotions of the people on the screen, then in a way, like you could get to experience emotions that you wouldn't be able to experience in other ways, right? So you could watch a scary movie at home, alone at night, and it might scare you. And you get to feel that terror, right? But is your life actually in danger? No, it's not, right? But you still get to have that, it's that buzz, right? You get to feel that experience without actually having to do that, right? You can watch an action movie and all kinds of dangerous things can happen, and Tom Cruise is like jumping off the top of buildings and landing on a motorcycle and doing all sorts of crazy things. And we can kind of feel that excitement without doing it, because of course doing it would be suicidal, right? You would die. But you can get that feeling, right? You can experience feelings in a safe manner, right? Without having to actually do those things yourself, right? You don't have to put your life in danger. You can just watch a scary movie and, feel that feeling on your own, right? And I think that applies to all feelings in movies, right? Whether you're feeling terrified or happy or excited or sad, right? You get to kind of experience and deal with those emotions without, the real stuff having to happen to you, right? Which is sometimes nice, right? You don't want to put your life in danger. You don't want sad things to happen to you, but sometimes it's good to kind of feel those emotions and work through them. Let me see. Oh yeah. Right, so we're going to talk about Gilgamesh, but here I think is a good place to pause. Okay, so I'm going to hand back your quizzes, and then I'll go over them very quickly. Okay, and so online people, it'll be a little different for you, and I'll post your grades on Student Portal tonight, I believe. But I will go over the written quiz here in class, and so you can definitely listen in. So online people, just give me a minute. I'm just going to stand up and hand some things back, and then I'll be right back. I did not forget that time. I'm so proud of myself. There you go. Here, Ivan is in the back corner. Pause here. Go. Pause here. Go. Nicholas is up here. You're welcome. No Sophie, no Vassal. Margaret's here. I think that's it. Oh, sorry. There you go. Alrighty, Roo. So, let's just review really quickly. Put my mic back on. Okay, quiz one. So, 7. Right, so the first question there, as you can see, was what are the 4 fields of anthropology? So what were they? What's that? Yeah, linguistic anthropology, biological or physical anthropology, cultural or social or sociocultural anthropology, and the 4th one? Archaeology, the best one. I'm biased. Or no, archaeology. So those were the 4, right? So all you had to do was state them, and that was good. What's culture? It's a cultural belief system, yeah. That's part of it.
System of beliefs, values, and artifacts that are common in a certain society.
Yeah, so the official definition that we said in the notes was that culture is a system of shared beliefs and values and behaviors and customs and artifacts, I think, that are common to members of a society. Okay, so if you manage to spit that out word for word, then I cannot fault you, and I gave you 2. Some people said that in different words, and so that was good enough. Like you're allowed to say things in different words. Actually, I kind of prefer it if you say things in different words. But some people were missing a few pieces, and so they got 1.5 or 1 1/4 or something like that. But either way, you didn't have to say the exact words, but I did want to see something like that. But that was the official one. 3 here, why would the ritual to induct a member of the Kwakwaka'wakw tribe into the Cannibal Bird Society not seem strange or bizarre to the Kwakwaka'wakw people? So I did a whole thing, and I explained this ritual and this sort of naked young man running in, clawing at people. And why it doesn't seem strange to them is that it was because it's a symbolic act, right? That ritual is full of symbols, and the Kwakwaka'wakw people, they understand those symbols, right? They've grown up in that culture. They understand how to interpret those things. And so because of that, that ritual has a very clear meaning to those people. And again, when they see that, they think, yep, I know what's going on here. I see the taming of hunger. I see the taming of negative influences inside us, just as we're trying to tame this wild man, right? So because of that, because of the knowledge of symbols and how meaning is encoded, the Kwakwaka'wakw people totally understand this ritual, right? Whereas us who maybe just showed up and watched, we would think, wow, how strange, right? And it was very strange. Ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. What was ethnocentrism? Yeah, judging other cultures based on the values and beliefs of your own culture, right? And then kind of the opposite end of that spectrum was cultural relativism, and what do we do there?
Judge based on what you learned.
Yeah, maybe.
Like judging on their practices of other people's culture basing on your understanding of your cultural values.
Just based on just that, nothing
In
else.
order to understand it in your own culture.
Yeah, I would probably say that even not so much judging, right, as trying to understand people's cultural behavior on their own terms, right? So, instead of saying, oh, these people do this, gosh, that's horrible and gross and ridiculous or backwards, instead it's like, oh, okay, well, why do they do that thing, right? Why do they believe the thing that they believe? And so trying to understand cultures kind of from their own perspective rather than from an outside perspective. And maybe not so much on the judgment, maybe not. Yeah. And then 5 was Jared Diamond's argument regarding humans' switch to agriculture. And so what was his conclusion, the main point?
It was a mistake.
Huge mistake, right? Epic fail, right? That was his conclusion. One of his premises was what? Because why should we believe that agriculture was a huge mistake?
It's time consuming.
Yes, but I think that was kind of maybe part of something else.
The nutritional diet of farmers are visibly worse compared to foraging.
Right. So there was that. There was a lot of information that I would probably just say it negatively affected their health, right? And so there was nutrition, there was evidence of disease, they weren't growing as high, there was enamel hypoplasia, there was all kinds of data that he used to say, their health really suffered, right? That was a big problem. What was another one? Right. So Jared Diamond says that we had the beginnings of sexual inequality with the beginning of farming, right? That was probably the second one. And the third one? What? Yeah, social hierarchies and class divisions, right? That was the third premise where, so why should we believe that switching to agriculture was a bad idea for these early farmers? Well, negatively affected their health, it created gender inequalities, and it created social inequalities in society, right? And so for all those reasons, it was a complete mistake for them to switch. But of course, Jared Diamond also says that they probably didn't have much of a choice, right? In order to feed their people, they probably had to do that. No, my camera's not part of this scene, but the audio is. So people can hear me, but they just don't have the little bubble there. Okay, so that was the quiz, good people. That's it. Come back tomorrow and we'll talk about Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll see what this story is all about. It's weird and bizarre, I promise you. But maybe we can try to learn some things about Mesopotamian culture and how they saw the world. But until then, that is all. I will see you tomorrow.